I'm going to switch you back now to Elijah Staggers, who has with him Dr. Jerry Jones, and they are going to have a discussion.
Thank you, Walt. Okay. I have with me here, for the pleasure of you all who don't know him, Dr. Jerry Jones. Dr. Jones was born in Glade Spring, Virginia. He's a recently retired professor from Henry College, a former Glade Spring Town Council member, and a fourth-generation descendant of the county's formerly enslaved persons. Dr. Jones's great-grandfather, Crockett Johnston, was born into slavery in 1844 in Wythe County. In 1870, so basically within 5 years of the end of the Civil War, the formerly enslaved Johnston built a home in Glade Spring, which was passed to Dr. Jones's grandmother and mother. Dr. Jones's uncle is someone who you all might be familiar with, Dr. Bascom Slemp Waugh, who's one of Washington County's prominent African Americans, and who we'll hear about in a later segment. Like the generations before him, Dr. Jones attended segregated public schools in Washington County and Bristol, Virginia during the 50s and 60s. Excuse me, and then he left for better educational and career opportunities. He actually obtained his bachelor's from what is now Virginia State University in Petersburg. Then he left the Commonwealth to teach high school in Baltimore. And so sort of while juggling teaching and graduate coursework, Dr. Jones obtained his graduate degree from Virginia State and his doctorate from Virginia Tech. He taught as a college professor for 27 years in Richmond and then returned to Glade Spring to care for his mother and teach as an adjunct and visiting professor at Emory and Henry College. Dr. Jones now resides in the same Glade Spring house that his great-grandfather, a former slave, purchased and paid for the construction of in 1870. A few years ago, he authored his, well, I call it a memoir, but his book, Go and Come Again, Segregation, Tolerance, and Reflection, a fourth-generation African-American struggle. And so we'll be talking a little bit about your book today, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for sitting with me and having this interview.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So I feel like I have known you my whole life after having had an opportunity to read your book. And you just seem like one of my great uncles who, you know, I'm just sort of meeting at a family reunion or just sort of having a talk at the kitchen table with. So I've really enjoyed our conversation thus far. I guess to start, can you describe the theme and title of your book, Go and Come Again?
Get that question a lot. Well, the obvious reason for that would be the best way of describing my life. When I left this area in the fall of 1965, I went off to college, and you have to have an idea of what it was like, not just in this area, but in this country in 1965. Segregation, while it had already been outlawed and was starting to make some turns, it still was in place. And I went off to college in 1965, and I returned again in 2001 to take care of Mom, and then ultimately to teach at Emory and Henry. So it describes my journey, and not just my journey, but the journey of others like me. Of course, not too many came back home. Some did, but I certainly did. That's one thing. The other thought about the heading of the book, or the title of the book, it was a saying of my mom. She had a sense of humor that I sometimes think I borrowed a little bit. And when she would be talking about preachers that would be sent to our church from the segregated Methodist conference of the 1950s and 60s, every once in a while, a preacher was not to her liking for whatever reason. And she would say, he needs to go and come again. So I can hear her voice saying that still. The other thought about the title of the book, it kind of takes me back to my main topic, which I taught all of those 52 years of being an educator, was most computers have 3 buttons. And if the computer just won't do right, you will hit the Control, the Alt, and Delete, and it will restart the computer. And I often say, now, if we just had a Control, Alt, and Delete to life events, there are all number of things that I'd like to just start over again. And one more thing about the title of the book, Go and Come Again. I didn't know it when I picked that title, but a friend of mine in Glade Spring told me it's in the Bible. So if it's in the Bible, then it's got to be good. Amen.
All right. Okay, and so I'd like to sort of focus our conversation and interview today on a couple of themes that I picked up in your book. The first one being Go and Come Again, which, like you mentioned, and as I stated in your biography, you and many other people in the generations before you, so, well, they didn't necessarily come again, but you had to sort of leave Southwest Virginia and Washington County at some point due to lack of opportunities, go seek those opportunities out in other parts of the state or even in Baltimore.
Sure.
But then you sort of felt compelled to return.
Sure enough.
And so that'll be one theme that I'd like to discuss with you. The second sort of is the racialization of property.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another theme I picked up in your book, just discussing the house that your great-grandfather built,
Mm-hmm.
the church that you write about a lot, Ebenezer,
Mm-hmm.
where certain schools for African Americans were located throughout Southwest Virginia, and just how property laws were used to sort of exclude people from certain areas, make certain things like education more difficult for certain people. And then the last sort of bucket that I'd like to talk about is race relations or sort of racial attitudes in Washington County. And as I mentioned during one of my earlier segments, I think sometimes it's very easy to sort of just read about history in a book, black and white. And somebody, some objective historian, hopefully objective historian, might categorize what the climate of something was like 50, 100 years later. But to have somebody who actually lived through those times and get an opportunity to share his personal anecdotes with us today, I think is extraordinary.
Sure.
So my next question is sort of in that Go and Come Again theme. So after you graduated from Virginia State in 1969, you didn't land any interviews for teaching jobs in Washington County, or really anywhere inside the entire Commonwealth. Do you feel like Washington County was receptive to an influx of Black educated professionals at that time? Did that maybe have something to do with why you weren't able to land any interviews?
Well, I did get some interviews. So let me start off by clarifying that.
Excuse me.
I didn't get an interview for Washington County.
Okay.
That part is true. I sent a letter asking for an application and got no response. But I did get calls from a few districts. I drove all the way to, and you must understand that I wasn't driving very much of a car in 1969. That's another story. But I drove to Roanoke, I drove to Richmond, not all at the same time, and I drove to Alexandria in Northern Virginia. They had me to come for an interview. But once I got there, their response was, but we don't have any vacancies. And even though I was only 21 or 22 at the time, I'm like, well, if you didn't have any vacancies, why did you call me to come all of this way? Who knows? Maybe they obviously knew that I was Black because I had graduated from Virginia State College, as it was called then. And back then, it was not historically Black, it was all Black. So most likely, if a person had a degree from Virginia State, you didn't need a picture or anything. You didn't even need to talk to me on the phone. You probably could conclude that I was African American or Black or whatever term we went by back in the 1960s. But to get to the point of that you raised there, it's a very appropriate term. Most school districts, even though the law was on my side, the Civil Rights Act was on my side, and Brown versus Board of Education had been on my side for decades or such, but still school districts were hesitant to accept an African American male or female. And this is probably one instance where being a male probably was harder for job seeking than female. I say that because there is some mystique then and now about African American young men being a danger to white women. Maybe that was what they were thinking. I have no idea. Mm-hmm. Then the joke could be that because of me being such a small statured person that they thought that I would not survive teaching high school. Who knows what their attitude or what their thought was. Bottom line was I could not find a job anywhere in the state of Virginia, ended up in Maryland and had to repay loans that I had received. Such loans would have been canceled had I gotten a job somewhere in Virginia.
But Dr. Jones, I just find that so hard to believe and sort of wrap my mind around, because you are a fourth generation sort of resident of
Yes.
Washington County, Southwest Virginia. You had known people here your entire life,
Yes.
including people that your mother and relatives and aunts and uncles
Yes.
knew. And it seems like after going to sort of, get that bachelor's from Virginia State, it could have been as easy as just making a phone call to somebody who you would have had a connection with, and basically relying on your network, like sometimes our white counterparts do when they apply for jobs. And it just seems like you shouldn't have had to go through all those hoops.
Shouldn't have, but it did. Part of that is, I'm glad you mentioned the word network. We had no network. And that may have been because even though my mother at the time had been working for Robert Porterfield, who was the founder of the Barter Theater here in Abingdon, that still was not the right network. We knew no major people in the school systems. Part of that is because when I left this area, I had never touched any area of the white school system that was in place. When I finished the 12th grade in spring of 1965, I had never set foot inside of the white high school that serviced Washington County, specifically Glade Spring. I knew no principals of any white high schools. I knew all the Black folks. That was my network, but they had no more power than I did. So I ended up in Baltimore. While you're looking for your next question, I'll just mention this about going to Baltimore. When I was 21, I was very upset. Now that I'm an old guy and can look back at the past, it was probably one of the best things that happened. We'll talk about that later.
Yes, we will. Okay. So my next questions, and you mentioned how even though you lived here for your entire life prior to going to college, you never connected to the white parts of society, or with regard to the school systems in the white schools.
That's true.
And so that sort of brings me to my next question, which has to do with sort of the racialization of property in associations, and where we can have things and how far we have to go to get things sometimes.
Okay.
Do you think the limited number of schools for Black children, which were located far distances from African-American populations in Washington County, was a form of intentional, systemic, or institutional racism? And you recall in your book how you had to travel like an hour, and some folks had to catch like 3 buses to get from like Glade Spring, as far as Bristol to go to Douglas High School. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. No question about it. Going to high school and having to go an hour and a half one way to get there, not only is cruel, not only is inconvenient, not only is it financially ridiculous, it's just downright crazy. But what we did was to satisfy not just Washington County, not just Southwest Virginia, we were satisfying state rules. Richmond personified. They are the ones that said that Blacks and whites will not go to school together. Other states in the South said the same thing. Can you imagine how much it costs school districts all across the South to have one entire school system for Blacks and pay for that, and then another school system for whites, pay for that, And when the blacks go to the school over here that has less resources, when we finish from that high school, then they say, but you didn't learn so-and-so. Well, guess what? Why didn't we learn? Because we did not have the resources that we needed to learn. So that could even be one reason why I wasn't hired as a teacher, to bring in the other question. Even though I had graduated from Virginia State, maybe some thought, well, he didn't go and get his bachelor's from Virginia Tech. So how do we know that he can teach high school? Who knows? But your point is well taken. It was systematic, and I'm not saying Washington County is to blame. Not even saying Virginia is to blame. I'm saying the whole country is to blame. The whole country is to blame. And I'm thankful that I lived long enough to see some moderation. One more point about that. We didn't, when I say we, I'm talking about we students, we youngsters. I'm not suggesting that we had on our minds every single day the injustice of going so far to school. When you are of a certain age, your mindset reflects that age. I can't think of me at age 8 talking about Brown versus Board of Education. I can't think at age 12 thinking about how much money it costs Washington County to pay to the city of Bristol, Virginia, to allow us to go there. When you are of a certain age, your mindset is fixed at a certain way. But the last point that I want to make on that issue is what we have, while it was not great, it was better than what my mother and Uncle Bascom that we're talking about later, what they had when they got to the 7th grade in this county. That was the end of their public school education. To go beyond the 7th grade, you had to go to extraordinary means. And we talked about that in the book, and most people know what those means were.
Yeah. And something else that I found really interesting in reading your book was you talk about the various teachers that you had, and oftentimes it would be like the mothers of some of the students. Like you might have to go to your mother might be, and one teacher might be teaching 3 or 4 or 5 different grades.
Yes.
To what extent was the African-American educational system in Washington County sort of self-sufficient in that regard? So not necessarily depending on resources or input from other folks. Was it mainly sort of self-sufficient in that regard?
Many of the teachers that I had in elementary school, especially, were people who were native to this county. In 7 years of elementary school, I only had 2 teachers. Both of them were male, by the way, and both of them were natives of this town, Abingdon. One had gone to Morristown College down in Tennessee, and the other was a recent graduate of A&T over in, I believe that's Greensboro in North Carolina. We had any number of Black school teachers, especially when I got to high school in Bristol. Our high school in Bristol was called Douglas High School, and we had teachers who had been brought to that area from across the land and country. I did not have one white teacher until I got to college. So that's 12 years of all Black education. We did have one white teacher at Douglas High School in Bristol, and he was the band director. But I was not able to be a member of the band, and that was because you just can't show up the first year of high school and start playing an instrument. That's something that begins usually in elementary school. And by the time you get to high school, you kind of can do the instrument. We couldn't do that. So I missed out on that. But self-sufficient, I guess that term is okay to describe this area. There were a lot of well-known teachers that were role models to me. And I guess I should use the word role model more than one time, because it certainly affected my life, not just in school, but in general, since I grew up in a home where there was no father present.
Gotcha. So here's another question I have sort of in regard to that racialization of property theme. So would you consider your almost forced exodus from the Commonwealth of Virginia due to lack of opportunities after college similar to the Commonwealth's practice that was alluded to earlier of sort of keeping its Black population low by ejecting free Blacks during slavery or forcing their removal after the Civil War through sort of vagrancy laws? So in other words, after they were freed, they didn't have anywhere to work, but then there were laws that prohibited vagrancy, and they would lock Black people up or force them into labor camps and stuff like that for quote unquote vagrancy.
I suppose that's possibility. I would think some people, we would be giving them too much credit for intellect to sit down and figure out exactly how they're going to do it. Some of it, I'll just be honest. Sometimes you say, how could they do that to Jerry? He's a good little kid. How could you dare do that to me? The point that I'm trying to make is simply this. Many of the decisions that were made remotely, and I don't mean by computer now. I mean the people that finally say yay or nay to the way people are treated might be somewhere other than right here. Of course, here they would go along with it. But I tend to blame Richmond for a lot of misgivings that I encountered way more than I blame Abingdon. And to carry that even further, I blame Washington, D.C. even more than I blame Richmond. And here's my point. My point is, go back to Brown versus Board of Education. That was 1954. I finished high school in 1965. If the Supreme Court says that separate but equal is unconstitutional in 54, why it take so long? I have enough sense to know that if the Supreme Court, and you're a lawyer, so back me up on this, if the Supreme Court says it's illegal, case is over. End of sermon. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so that sort of brings me to my next questions, and I only have two more. I hope we're doing okay here on time. You mentioned sort of a distinction between maybe the policies and views that might have came from Richmond versus the policies or views that might have been present here in Washington County with regard to its white population. So that brings me to my next issue of sort of race relations and racial attitudes here in Washington County. So you wrote in your book that during the 50s and 60s in Glade Spring, neighborhoods were often mixed with Blacks and whites living side by side, and that racially charged violence and slurs were sort of few and far between. But then you later sort of distinguish, like mere tolerance from actually getting along. So how would you describe race relations during your early years here in Washington County in the 50s and 60s? Was it more of just tolerating each other, or was there actually getting along?
Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier about my mindset in those early years. And the thing that I remember, especially in the 1950s, because I was born in 47. Now, I don't remember the 40s at all, but in the early 50s, especially, that was a joyous time. And I'm trying to answer to myself, well, why was I so happy? I had all these friends to play with, Black and white. My house was big. I had a big yard then, and we had something in my yard called croquet. You may not know what that is, but my yard was the focal point for kids having a good time, especially in the summertime like what we have now. So my point is simply that was enjoyable. I don't remember worrying about civil rights or anything. First of all, in 1951, 52, and early of 53, you couldn't even have a television in this area. I mean, if you had money to buy a TV, you could buy one, but there was no TV station in this region until the fall of 53. So there were some years where radio and backyard was it. We used to have something called lawn parties and things of that sort. So all of that was a happy time. Even in the 1960s, and I went off to high school in 1966, 60, finished in 65. everyone had television then. So even though it was still kind of laid back in Washington County, we watched the news kind of regularly, and we started to hear the incidents about segregation and whatnot, places like Little Rock, places like Clinton, Tennessee, and other areas that had violence as people were trying to get their right to a high school education. But it was mostly talk. There was nothing that I remember in this area that caused me to be concerned. There was nothing in this area that told me when I left my mom to live alone, when I went off to college in 1965, I knew she'd be okay. She had good neighbors, black and white, that would look out for her. I don't know that I'd be able to say that today, but in 1965, I could say that. Case in point, and I'll tell you this and move on. When I got to college one year, I had to do student teaching. And so in order to do student teaching, I had to take my car, my old 1960, whatever it was, that was a sometimey car. Have you ever heard the word sometimey?
Oh, yes, I have.
Okay. I had a sometimey car. And I had to take it to Petersburg so that I would have it available to do my student teaching. By the way, my student teaching was going to be in Alexandria in the DC metro area. I thought I was a bad student then. But anyway, I had never driven a long distance before in that car or any car. So that when I had to go back to Virginia State, my mother, who had never driven before, decided to ride with me with that long commute from Glade Spring to Petersburg, which was roughly 200 or more miles.
And this was before interstates.
This was, well, no, it wasn't that far back. I did have Interstate 81,
Okay.
but some of it was.
Okay.
But anyway, the point of my story is that just to show you her dedication, and I'm trying to point to her dedication as well as the kindness of her black and white neighbors. She rode with me all the way to Petersburg. We got there in one piece. And then she jumped on the passenger train and rode all the way back just after she got there. Talk about dedication. And when she got back to Glade Spring, it was like midnight. And her neighbors, black and white, knew that she was coming home at midnight in town. They all were standing on their front porch with the light on. That was the type of attitude that I remember from Glade Spring. Would it be that way today? And it's not knocking Glade Spring, it's just knocking society in general. Everybody is into their own thing. There's not that community cohesiveness that I remember from the 50s and 60s. Maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe somebody will come to my aid when I need it.
I'm sure. Okay, here's my last question, because I know we are pressed for time. So in your book, you recall several instances of racial hostility, once being in Washington County specifically. Once being in 1968, involving, I believe his name is Reverend Hickman at Johnston Memorial Hospital, and a second in the late 70s when Martin Luther King Sr. came to speak in Abingdon. And I'd just be happy if you could just maybe share your memories of those events with us.
Let me talk about Reverend Hickman first, because many here in Abingdon, if anybody from Abingdon is watching, may remember that he pastored a number of years at Charles Wesley United Methodist Church, which is just down Main Street a little ways from where we are now. He also, many of the preachers back then had at least several churches. So he preached at Charles Wesley in Abingdon, and he preached at Ebenezer in Glade Spring. So that's why I got to know him. And he would preach at Charles Wesley first, I guess 11 a.m. service. And he would come to us at around 12:30 the same Sunday afternoon, that's 12:30 was. And so he came in one day and he was visibly upset. And we asked him, was there something wrong? And he said that he was in the hospital, as he often was, visiting the sick, and that there was this lady, this white lady that was very ill, and he went into her room and asked, could he pray with her? And her response was that she didn't want a blank N-word preacher praying over her. And I thought about that because I figured, I saw your list of questions. I said, now what do I remember about that? I know what he said, she said, but I don't remember him saying, well, what illness did she have? How under sedation was she, if at all? Was she a young 20-something, or was she a 7? You say, well, what did that matter? She said something that she shouldn't have said. Yes, she did. And it made the preacher feel bad. But here's something that happened to me that made me think twice. As you heard me say before, I had to care for my mother 4 years before she passed away. I was her primary caregiver because my one and only brother died the day I moved back here from Richmond. She had Alzheimer's. And in the early stages of Alzheimer's, her personality changed. She said some things, and it's kind of ironic that I'm saying this. She said some things that normally she would have never said. Mm-hmm. And as I was mowing the yard the other day, pawning what you would ask me, I said, I wonder, could this lady that dissed the preacher, could she have been suffering something that would have caused her to blurt that out? Most people, when they feel well, they don't say anything, or they say very little. But I find it ironic that she said that, but your facts are correct. She said it. Now, let me talk about the other quickly. The Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., it wasn't Abingdon where he preached. He came to Emory. He preached in the beautiful chapel at Emory and Henry College. But the visit was sponsored by the St. Charles Wesley Church here in Abingdon. They felt they needed a bigger place because, after all, that's Martin Luther King Jr. That's it. That's Daddy King,
as they say.
And he was at least, he may not have hit 80 yet, but he was pretty close. And when he walked into well, let me back up. The reason I was there is because one of my cousins, who's kin to Frankie Newton, that we were talking about later today, that her last name was Newton, by the way, Rebecca Newton, asked me to play music in the chapel as people gathered for this event. And when I finished my little part, I went into the sit down in the auditorium. In walks Reverend King, and a state trooper walks in with him and sits beside him in the pulpit as the sermon was delivered. Someone had called in a threat on Reverend King's life. And so the bottom line to that story is, why? What nut would want to send in a message of harm against, first of all, forget about the fact that he was MLK Jr.'s daddy. The man's a senior citizen. The man's a child of God. The man is in a church, in a sanctuary, and you're going to threaten his wife? To me, that would be like, I have nothing that can excuse that. If the man was sick, he needed to find some help there. I found it ironic that a lot of people did not know of that event, even people who had been affiliated with Emory for years. Maybe it's because it was not their event, it was the church's event, but still it was on campus.
Mhm.
And it happened. And I was there, and it was not a happy time.
I can imagine.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Jones, those are all the questions that I have prepared for you. Maybe I'll say this in closing.
Yes.
I thought it very poetic in your conclusion of your book. You basically say something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, after all this time, the house of Johnston, Waugh, Jones still stands.
Yes.
It is still standing.
Yes.
May I suggest that it is standing in part because of you
Okay.
and the things that you have done and the things that you've documented in this book. So I'm just very happy to know that after all these years, after four generations coming out of slavery, especially with the issue of Black generational wealth being as problematic as it is today,
Sure.
you all were able to keep that house within your family
Yes.
and perpetuate the stories and anecdotes that go along with it. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and having the ability to interview you today, Dr. Jones. I think we have one of your relatives, Dr. Dyann Waugh, who is your cousin, is that right? And her father is Dr. Bascom Slemp Waugh, who is very prominent here in Washington County and has gone on to do some very great things in the medical field and the military field and all that stuff. But I don't want to take your thunder because I think you and Dr. Dyann will discuss him in our next segment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Awesome.
Should I start video? They told me to. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Jerry.
That's it.
How are you?
Hello.
Have him repeat that.
Oh, I'll repeat that.
Yeah, have her repeat.
Oops. I just messed it up.
Try now.
Made it small. Can't I get the again?
Hello.
No.
Okay, we're going to work on getting the feedback squared away, and then we'll proceed.
Okay.
Dr. Waugh, give it a try.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
And you can see me too?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see myself. Oh, yeah. I guess I can. I guess it's the view that I have. Okay, that's better. I have a gallery view. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think there's a feedback issue on your end, Dr. Waugh.
Oh, really?
Did you hear feedback?
I heard it, but I heard it when Jerry was speaking.
Oh, yeah, I hear it too.
Already did. Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So good afternoon again. This has been so interesting. I've never heard a long presentation on genealogy before, but I'm especially interested in all the history that I've learned regarding Washington County. I think this is quite an undertaking in a historical society. I'm just very grateful for this. I've learned a lot about the area that my father and Jerry's mom, brother and sister, learned a lot about that area just by listening to what you said today, and the prominent people of great accomplishment who have come from that area, from being enslaved, and their various accomplishments. I'm just very grateful to to have heard this, and honored to participate. Thank you. So I think Elijah was going to ask me some questions, but it looks like everybody's muted but me. He's still muted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, we were getting some feedback. Some feedback on our end, but it sounds a little better now. Is there feedback on your end? Can you hear me okay now still?
I can.
Okay. Oh, you know what? Let me try to, okay. Can you say something, Dr. Dyann?
Okay.
Okay,
again.
awesome. Okay, great. I think we fixed the problem. Sorry, technology.
Okay, good.
Sometimes it'll work with you, but then most times it'll work against you. But okay, so we're getting there.
Way too often.
Yes. So I actually, for those, I guess, we know what happened the other day when the three of us were on a call, but obviously the other participants of the Zoom call do not. You all had an opportunity to sort of sit down and discuss your father, Dr. Bascom Slemp Waugh. And I really just got a chance to listen. I think I prompted you with a couple of questions, but it was just so great to sort of sit down and listen and hear you all share stories about who he was as a person. I'm able to sort of provide a general background of his life from what I know, but I think what's interesting here is I can't paint a picture of who he was as a person, right? There are certain stories that you know about the type of man he was, the type of things that he did for the community that are not necessarily always included in his biography. And so maybe as far as I understand, I can sort of give a background to his accomplishments in his life, but I really like for you to speak to the type of man and person that he was to you as a father, and also sort of what he meant to the members of the sort of South Jersey and Camden community where he maintained his practice, who he served, who he was able to provide medical care to, who couldn't maybe otherwise afford it, and things of that nature. So as far as what I recall, and Dr. Jones, feel free to chime in here, Dr. Bascom Slemp Waugh was born here in Washington County, is that right?
Right, in the house.
In the house that your great-grandfather purchased and paid for. And Dr. Bascom wasn't able to get any sort of public education here, is that right? So he had
elementary school.
So he had to go to, was it Roanoke and Baltimore in order to get educated. After that, I think he attended Morgan State University, is that right? And then he also got his medical degree from Meharry Medical College. And I'm not sure if it was before or after, but he was also a service member. He served as a Tuskegee Airman, is that correct?
Yes, he was a flight surgeon with the 332nd Airborne.
So we're talking about a native son of Washington County who went on to medical school at Meharry, served as a Tuskegee Airman, and then went on to Camden, New Jersey, or sort of that area, and established a medical practice. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think it's just so, because it was a very community focused medical sort of practice. He was a solo practitioner. It wasn't like, as you said, with Dr. Jones, where he was sort of affiliated with this greater hospital and might have only been able to provide medical care to the wealthy or the elite who could afford it. From what I recall, you said he sort of set up his practice across or near from the public housing projects. And he would sort of do house calls and provide medical care to folks in the housing projects, folks of Polish descent and other Eastern Europeans who we know there was much discrimination against them. But at the same time, he didn't have an ego from what you described, right? He was so humble and never really talked much about, made sort of a big deal about himself or his accomplishments. So like I said, I can sort of provide the frame for who he is on paper, but I'd really like for you to just share any personal stories that you and Dr. Jones may have about how he impacted your life as his daughter, and then also the other members of sort of the Waugh family, and members of the community too. If you could just talk to that, I think folks would be interested to hear your sort of anecdotes.
Okay, well, thank you. As you said, my dad was from Glade Spring, and when he went to college, when he did go to Morgan State College, interestingly enough, he once said, and I have to tell you, my father did not talk very much about himself. And my biggest regret is that I didn't just sit down with him, as people have spoken of earlier, and really gotten videos and anecdotes and so on, and recorded him. But he actually told me once that he played football in college, which I thought was the most amazing thing, because he kept saying, I'm just a little bitty guy. I was like, how did you ever play football? I can't even believe that, because he was probably about 5'7", 5'8". He wasn't very tall. And he was a little heavier than Jerry, but he definitely did not look like anybody's idea of a football player today. But he did play football, and he said he worked for the Postal Service one summer carrying mail and thought it was a terribly difficult job and didn't want to ever do that again. Worked in Atlantic City, doing kind of bellman work and packing people's bags into cars, and that type of thing. And then, as we said, attended Meharry Medical School. One of the anecdotes that I've told my children is that he didn't have enough money to purchase books when he was in medical school. So what he would do is he would wait until his classmates went to bed, and then he would borrow their books and use them to study, to prepare for his classes.
Wow.
And he told me this story once about how he went to class and he was asked to describe a particular bone. And so he began to describe the bone. He described every bit of the bone. I mean, when you describe bones, there are fissures and there's attachments for this ligament, et cetera, the shape, the length. He did all of that. And then the professor asked him to come up and pick out the bone on the table, and he couldn't figure out which bone it was. As a medical student myself, who struggled with what we called the bone box, we had to take home this long black box full of all kinds of bones, and then we were supposed to look at them and figure out which bone was which and learn all those things that he had learned. I could imagine how difficult that was, to just pick out the right bone. But he certainly had the description down perfectly. He had an excellent memory. He had, as Elijah said, he was very humble, didn't talk about himself very much, but was very dedicated to his community and to his patients. His office was in Camden, New Jersey, in South Camden, across the street from a housing project. And we lived for the first 6 years of my life above his office. He actually went into practice in the 30s. Okay, he graduated from medical school in 1935 and interned at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is the hospital affiliated with Howard University Hospital, and the medical school that I went to, Howard University College of Medicine. But he moved to Camden in the 30s, late 30s, and so he was practicing there before he went into the military. So when he left, then he came back to his practice. He and my mother met. Well, my mother was in high school because he was 10 years older than she. And they married before he left to go into the military. My mother was an elementary school teacher. And so when they came back, I was born in 1946. So Jerry and I are just a year apart, right? And we moved when I was 6 to Haddonfield, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Camden. It's like a 15 minute at most, probably about a 10-minute ride, not very far. My parents moved there because they wanted me to have a better education, and the public schools in Haddonfield are really excellent. The problem is that there are hardly any Black people in the town of Haddonfield, and in my high school, actually, there are only 6, all girls. Because it is South Jersey, and there's one town after another, and there's Camden, there's an all-Black town founded by formerly enslaved people right next to Haddonfield. It's called Lawnside, 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 New Jersey. There were many opportunities to interact with Black people all around in South Jersey and also in Philadelphia. So my mother belonged to different organizations. My father, of course, had many contacts. So I did have a very active social life, because in the 50s, if I had to rely on the kids I was going to school with, I would have been a very unhappy person. My parents knew that, because there was a certain amount of rejection. I mean, from the moment we moved in, actually, I think Jerry pointed this out in the book. When my parents bought the land for the house that they were building, they actually had some friends purchase the land, some very light-skinned friends who looked like they were white, and therefore the land was sold to them, because it would have never been sold to Black people. Mm-hmm. So our friends, who were another physician and his wife, purchased the land and then sold it to my parents for $1. And my parents had this house built by a wonderful man, one of my father's patients, actually, who was from Switzerland. He had a very strong Swiss accent, and he was a master craftsman, and built the house with a great deal of attention to detail. And when my parents went to visit the house, I think Jerry mentioned this, my mother would dress as if she were a maid. My father dressed as if he were a worker, so that people didn't get upset and see that Black people were actually going to move into their neighborhood. So then when we moved...
Dr. Dyann, can I tell you, I laughed real hard about that at first, but that's really sad. And can we just take a step back and realize how sad it is that, up and coming Black professionals had to dress as laborers and domestics and sort of go into neighborhoods under cover and under guise, because they were afraid of what their white neighbors would say.
In the North.
If in the North.
In the North.
Once they knew that Black folks were moving into the neighborhood.
This is just south of Philly, just across the bridge in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and then when we moved in, and they realized that there were Black people in this house, it was just my parents and me. They were very upset. They began to pull up the bushes, the shrubbery around the house, and throw eggs at the windows. And the memory that I have as a 6-year-old is having this group of white men come to the front door to talk to my father about how he shouldn't stay, and to say that, this isn't the right community for you. You're really not welcome here. We don't want you to live here. And that was the time when I saw my father, because the next thing they said was, and look, because I was standing in the corner somewhere, they said, look, and you don't want your little girl to grow up where she's not wanted, do you? And my father just looked at them and said, this is my home. This is my house. And I'm staying here. We're not leaving. Mm-hmm. This is our home. Mm. And then he showed them out. He showed them out.
More polite than I would have been. But I understand different times. And obviously,
yes, different times. But that was my father. He was not a person that I ever heard yell. I never heard him shout. He was a very contained, very calm personality. That's the way he was. And so that's the way he presented himself at all times, including in a moment of stress. He was just very matter of fact and said, no, we're staying, and that's the end of it. Mm-hmm. And then it carried on. Actually, I heard someone mention Quakers, and I just wanted to comment that when we moved there, my father was a Methodist, and my mother was Baptist. And when we lived in Camden, we were just like a block from a Baptist church where my great aunt used to go. And we used to go there a lot because my great aunt raised my mother in New Jersey, brought her up from Georgia, took the oldest child from Georgia and brought her up to New Jersey to make sure she went to school and got educated. So there in Camden, we went to the Baptist church, but in Haddonfield, there were many churches. Haddonfield is full of churches, let me just say, but none of the churches wanted us to come. We were not welcome in the Baptist church, the Methodist church, or anybody else's church. And then one day, a group of Quakers came to our home and said, we would very much like it if you would come and worship with us at Haddonfield Friends Meeting. And my father said, these people are real. These people are sincere, and we will go to their church. So we started going to a friend's church, the Quaker Meeting House in Haddonfield, and went there the whole time that I was there. My mother taught Sunday school, first day school there. I played the piano for singing before we had meeting, which is what we call the service before we had meeting. And I still have connections to the Friends meeting here where I am in Maryland. So just to give you a sense of, that's the kind of person that my father was. As you pointed out, he had patients in Camden of all ethnicities. We were right across the street from the projects. He never moved his office. He never changed the way he practiced. It just became more difficult with the paperwork in later years, which has driven a lot of people out of private practice because of the kind of paperwork and the reimbursement difficulties and all that. I have classmates who have had issues with that and have looked for and succeeded in these days in finding jobs. But my father used to get up in the middle of the night and go and make house calls. And as Jerry mentioned in his book, sometimes if people couldn't pay, he would take something else that they would give him, like food, like eggs or something like that. Because that's the kind of person he was. And I admired him very much. He didn't have hobbies. His idea of relaxing was coming home and sitting down in his rocking chair and reading medical journals. He read the newspaper and he read medical journals, and he listened to music. He had no musical abilities whatsoever, couldn't sing, couldn't dance, couldn't hold a tune. My mother and I were the ones singing. He enjoyed music. He enjoyed music, but it was not a gift of his, no sense of rhythm. No, it all. So, but he was very appreciative of all kinds of dance, all kinds of music. But mostly what he did was work. And he took off in the summer. He took about a week or two weeks vacation in the summer, where they would go to the National Medical Association convention, followed often by a trip to Georgia to visit my mother's parents, who were from a very rural area in Georgia. So we would go there. Sometimes I would go with them. It was really rural. I mean, when you stood on the front porch, you couldn't see any other houses. It was that rural. So so it was. I thought it was pretty boring, but that was what we did, and he seemed to really enjoy that. Just to be able to be there and to be quiet, to just sit on the porch, maybe play some cards, but mostly, he would just enjoy sitting there. I think, he would say from time to time, "This reminds me of being back in Glade Spring, where it was, where it was really quiet and peaceful." And then after about 2 weeks of being away, we went back, and he never took another vacation the rest of the year. So he was a really hard worker, very dedicated to what he did. And actually, there were a couple of things that I learned from that. One was that I didn't want to practice medicine like he did if I went into medicine, because it was just a little too much. I wanted more of a life, I wanted more opportunities to be with my family and to take trips and to have vacations and so on. So I went another track. I was at first I went into the Peace Corps. I majored in anthropology at American U, and I went into the Peace Corps after that. And after those 2 years, I came back, went to graduate school in nutrition, and I thought that I was going to be a nutritionist until I ran into someone that I had met at a National Medical Association convention, and she was a physician, and I just felt so jealous. And I thought, okay, this is no way to live the rest of my life. I'm not going to be a person who is jealous. I'm just going to go and do that too. Yeah. So I went on to medical school, and the specialty that I chose was occupational medicine after I did a radiology residency and found out it was too far away from people. Actually, I chose occupational environmental medicine. And my father was really excited when I got a job with the Postal Service, where I recently retired from after 31 years there. He was really excited because he said, "Oh, this is going to be great for you, kid." He said, "You're going to have regular hours. You're going to have a retirement. You're going to have a vacation. You'll have time with your family." He was pleased that I was going to have some of the things that I thought perhaps maybe he missed, but he loved what he did. But he wanted me to have something a little different, which was fine because I wanted something a little different as well. And so I always advise people who are thinking about medicine to not think narrowly, to think about all the different ways that you can practice medicine. I have a master's in public health from Hopkins, and I did my residency in occupational environmental medicine there. I think that my father really inspired me to strive for excellence. You know, he was board certified in internal medicine. He was a fellow of the American College of Physicians. So I'm boarded in OCMED, and I'm a fellow of the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine. I just feel like it's very important to strive for excellence. Regarding inspiration, I think that my father did inspire others in the community. I don't know I don't know how much actual mentoring he did because he was so busy, but he did mentor younger physicians who came to town. I know that they came and they talked to him, and he would advise them. He always treated his patients so well. He was the first Black physician on the staff of Cooper Hospital in Camden. And actually, when I went there a couple of years ago, in the corridor, there's a picture of him and some history about him, which is like really exciting. And they dedicated a small park in Camden to him and another physician, and they have their pictures there. Our family went for the dedication. So it's really nice to know that he was appreciated, and he was like the senior doc for the Black physicians who came to the Camden, the South Jersey area. He had been there the longest. And so he was able to pass on whatever knowledge he had to them. Most important to me, though, I think, is the way he taught me to treat other people. That was one of the things that he always said: always treat other people the way you would like to be treated. And he lived that every day. He was just a very compassionate person. He was a listener and not a talker. I'm more of a talker. I listen too, but when I think about it, because his focus on community, and after we talked earlier this week, I started thinking about his focus on community, and I thought, how did that impact my life? And then I realized that I consciously chose to practice occupational medicine in an organization. At first, I worked in an OCMED clinic, but then I decided I wanted to see what it would be like to be inside an organization. And the Postal Service is an extraordinary organization. It's huge. And I had the opportunity to work with many people, postal workers, and then, people who are carrying mail, and sales and service distribution associates, the people you see when you go to buy your stamps, the drivers, the maintenance people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I also was able to work with safety people and engineers and managers and supervisors, because that's what you do in occupational medicine, to try to make this workplace safe and to prevent people from getting ill. So during the anthrax of 2001, that was my building. So that was really my real opportunity to step up and really do what I could for our employees at that time. And so I realized that I had my own community. My father had his community that he served, and I was fortunate enough, blessed enough, really, to have a community that I have been able to serve. And actually, with the COVID, even though I've retired, I've been doing work with postal employees to help them get back to work. So I feel that my father set an example for me and for my family. And I'm just so grateful to Jerry for writing his book. It's such an amazing book. I could have never written anything like that. You just know so much about our family. I'm excited. Our family's going to come down and visit. We haven't been there in a really long time. The importance of connections, the importance of family and history and legacy is just ever more apparent to me, and especially with this program. So I just thank you so much.
Dr. Jones, can I say that your memory is ridiculously precise? Like you are able to just recall details. I don't know like what I had for lunch yesterday. I couldn't tell you, but you're able to recall things from decades ago with just a vivid.
More so than current, yes.
Yeah, with just a vivid, like you paint pictures in these paragraphs from such times, where I'm sure other folks would have trouble sort of recalling some of the details. Maybe briefly, because you talk about Dr. Bascom several times in your book, and it's very clear that he held sort of a special place in your heart and a special relationship, especially because, you really would sort of travel up to Camden in South Jersey to see him, and it was sort of a different dynamic. You mentioned different sort of racial dynamics between the North and down here, but then you also talk about seeing things that Dr. Bascom was able to sort of accumulate, his nice house and things like that, and how that had an impact on you as you were growing up.
When we were talking earlier this week, I had forgotten about this, but it came back after we hung up. We talked about so many things. For a while, I lived in the house where he had stayed, I don't know how long, while he was attending Morgan State. When I went to Baltimore, my first year, I think I stayed at the Y. Talk about poor teachers. And then I moved from the Y because someone broke into my car, stole stuff. So one of my other uncles, Uncle Arthur, helped me to find a home to stay in, to rent a room in while I was in Baltimore. Dyann, do you remember Helen
Roberts?
Yes,
because she came and lived with us later in life.
Didn't she live until 104 or
something like that?
But I lived with this elderly lady in Baltimore, and in one of the vacant bedrooms is the picture of Uncle Bascom that's been in my Glade Spring house forever. So it was like, well, I must be in pretty good shape because this is where so that was one thing. The other thing that I remember about Uncle Bascom, and I shared this with Dyann when we were talking the other day. One major visit I remember, of course, was our family reunion from 1981. But later in the 80s, Bascom and Bert came to Glade Spring by themselves. I don't even know whether Dyann remembers this trip or not. And that was one trip that we really, the combination was unique because at the homecoming in 81, there were so many there, you couldn't relate. And Uncle Ted and Uncle Bascom had a very unique conversation together. And they talked about some stuff that I had never heard before, like the nickname for their dad. And his nickname was the Wheel. Don't know what that means. Don't know what it meant then, but that's what they called it, the Wheel. And so I got the feeling from their conversation there that the brothers, if you will, and by the way, the first 4 births in that family were male. There was Theodore, Crockett, Bascom, and the boy that died, Eddie. 4 boys in a row. I even know which of the bedrooms was the boys' room. So when y'all come down, we're going to have a tour of his room. Okay.
Okay.
So let's go.
Yeah. Well, Walt, I know we are, and I apologize for this, a little behind on our schedule here. I thought we had potentially had a portion for Q&A, maybe from the audience. I don't know if we have time to take 1 or 2 questions, or if you just want to move on to the next segment.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Waugh?
Try now.
Do we have any questions? Do we have any questions for Dr. Waugh? Or for Jerry, for that matter? Any questions for either Dr. Waugh or Jerry Jones? Well, we certainly appreciate both of you being involved in this conference. It's been a real treat to hear you and to hear about your book, Jerry, and of course to hear about Dr. Waugh from Dr. Waugh. And it's a pleasure meeting you. Tell you what, let's take about a 5 or 10 minute break. We will be listening to a little bit of music from Frank Newton, and that will be a good segue into the presentation about Frank Newton. So have your volumes turned up enough that you can hear the music. And then when the break ends, then we'll go into the presentation about Frank Newton.